Lesson 25. Non-auditory effects of noise. First listen and then answer the following question. What conclusion does the author draw about noise and health in this piece? Many people in industry and the services who have practical experience of noise regard any investigation of this question as a waste of time. They are not prepared even to admit the possibility that noise affects people. On the other hand, those who dislike noise will sometimes use most inadequate evidence to support their pleas for a quieter society. This is a pity, because noise abatement really is a good cause, and it is likely to be discredited if it gets to be associated with bad science. One allegation often made is that noise produces mental illness. A recent article in a weekly newspaper, for instance, was headed with a striking illustration of a lady in a state of considerable distress, with the caption, "She was yet another victim, reduced to a screaming wreck." On turning eagerly to the text, one learns that the lady was a typist who found the sound of office typewriters worried her more and more until eventually she had to go into a mental hospital. Now, the snag in this sort of anecdote is, of course, that one cannot distinguish cause and effect. Was the noise a cause of the illness, or were the complaints about noise merely a symptom? Another patient might equally well complain that her neighbors were combining to slander her and persecute her, and yet one might be cautious about believing this statement. What is needed in the case of noise is a study of large numbers of people living under noisy conditions to discover whether they are mentally ill more often than other people are. Some time ago, the United States Navy, for instance, examined a very large number of men working on aircraft carriers. The study was known as Project Anahin. It can be unpleasant to live even several miles from an aerodrome. If you think what it must be like to share the deck of a ship with several squadrons of jet aircraft, you will realize that a modern Navy is a good place to study noise. But neither psychiatric interviews nor objective tests were able to show any effects upon these American sailors. This result merely confirms earlier American and British studies. If there is any effect of noise upon mental health, it must be so small that present methods of psychiatric diagnosis cannot find it. That does not prove that it does not exist, but it does mean that noise is less dangerous than, say, being brought up in an orphanage, which really is a mental health hazard. D.E. Broadbent, Non-Auditory Effects of Noise, from Science Survey.
Lesson 26, The Past Life of the Earth. First listen and then answer the following question. What is the main condition for the preservation of the remains of any living creature? It is animals and plants which lived in or near water whose remains are most likely to be preserved. For one of the necessary conditions of preservation is quick burial, and it is only in the seas and rivers, and sometimes lakes, where mud and silt have been continuously deposited, that bodies and the like can be rapidly covered over and preserved. But even in the most favorable circumstances, only a small fraction of the creatures that die are preserved in this way before decay sets in, or even more likely, before scavengers eat them. After all living creatures live by feeding on something else, whether it be plant or animal, dead or alive. And it is only by chance that such a fate is avoided. The remains of plants and animals that lived on land are much more rarely preserved, for there is seldom anything to cover them over. When you think of the innumerable birds that one sees flying about, not to mention the equally numerous small animals like field mice and voles, which you do not see, it is very rarely that one comes across a dead body, except, of course, on the roads. They decompose and are quickly destroyed by the weather or eaten by some other creature. It is almost always due to some very special circumstances that traces of land animals survive, as by falling into inaccessible caves or into an ice crevasse like the Siberian mammoths, when the whole animal is sometimes preserved as in a refrigerator. This is what happened to the famous Borisovka mammoth, which was found preserved and in good condition. In his mouth were the remains of fir trees, the last meal that he had before he fell into the crevice and broke his back. The mammoth has now been restored in the Paleontological Museum in St. Petersburg. Other animals were trapped in tar pits, like the elephants, saber-toothed cats, and numerous other creatures that are found at Rancho La Brea, which is now just a suburb of Los Angeles. Apparently what happened was that water collected on these tar pits, and the bigger animals, like the elephants, ventured out onto the apparently firm surface to drink, and were promptly bogged in the tar. And then, when they were dead, the carnivores, like the saber-toothed cats and the giant wolves, came out to feed and suffered exactly the same fate. There are also endless numbers of birds in the tar as well. Errol White, The Past Life of the Earth, from Discovery.
Lesson 27. The Vasa. First listen and then answer the following question. What happened to the Vasa almost immediately after she was launched? From the 17th century Empire of Sweden, the story of a galleon that sank at the start of her maiden voyage in 1628 must be one of the strangest tales of the sea. For nearly 3.5 centuries, she lay at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor until her discovery in 1956. This was the Vasa, royal flagship of the great imperial fleet. King Gustavus Adolphus, the Northern Hurricane, then at the height of his military success in the 30 Years' War, had dictated her measurements and armament. Triple gun decks mounted 64 bronze cannon. She was intended to play a leading role in the growing might of Sweden. As she was prepared for her maiden voyage on August 10th, 1628, Stockholm was in a ferment. From the Skeppsbron and surrounding islands, the people watched this thing of beauty begin to spread her sails and catch the wind. They had labored for 3 years to produce this floating work of art. She was more richly carved and ornamented than any previous ship. The high stern castle was a riot of carved gods, demons, knights, kings, warriors, mermaids, cherubs, and zoomorphic animal shapes ablazed with red and gold and blue. Symbols of courage, power, and cruelty were portrayed to stir the imaginations of the superstitious sailors of the day. Then the cannons of the anchored warships thundered a salute, to which the Vasa fired in reply. As she emerged from her drifting cloud of gun smoke, with the water churned to foam beneath her bow, her flags flying, pennants waving, sails filling in the breeze, and the red and gold of her superstructure ablaze with color, she presented a more majestic spectacle than Stockholmers had ever seen before. All gun ports were open, and the muzzles peeped wickedly from them. As the wind freshened, there came a sudden squall, and the ship made a strange movement, listing to port. The ordnance officer ordered all the port cannon to be heaved to starboard to counteract the list, but the steepening angle of the decks increased. Then the sound of rumbling thunder reached the watchers on the shore as cargo, ballast, ammunition, and 400 people went sliding and crashing down to the port side of the steeply listing ship. The lower gun ports were now below water, and the inrush sealed the ship's fate. In that first glorious hour, the mighty Vasa, which was intended to rule the Baltic, sank with all flags flying in the harbor of her birth. Roy Sanders, The Raising of the Vasa, from The Listener.